My presentation is titled Calamity at Kent State by Samantha Ackower. Hello, my name is John Philo. I was a senior and photojournalism major at Kent State University back in 1970. It was there that one of the most controversial events in college history took place. No one knows exactly why the National Guard fired upon war protesters on campus, killing 4 students and injuring 9 others. I was developing film in the student photography lab when I heard shots ring out. I quickly grabbed my camera and ran outside. I wasn't concerned for my safety because I thought they were shooting my blanks. I turned to my left and noticed a wounded and bleeding body, who I later found out was Jeffrey Miller. Oh my God, I thought they're firing real bullets. A young girl knelt down next to the body and began to sob violently. I snapped a photograph. You may be asking yourself, how did this ever happen in the first place? I remember I was watching television when President Richard Nixon publicly announced his decision to invade Cambodia and enter the United States into the war. Congress had not approved his decision, and many Americans became very angry. Generally speaking, the Kent State student body at that time was not known for protesting. A portion of the students were activists, but certainly not the majority. On May 1st, a demonstration was held in the Commons area. A group of history students buried the Constitution and burned their draft cards. This announcement drew in students from other colleges and universities, as well as vigilantes and activists. Following the demonstration, the crowd headed to bars in downtown Kent. When the university president forced early curfew, the intoxicated crowd of protesters then vandalized the downtown area. Notice how I said protesters, not Kent State students, as there were many others involved in the damaging activities. The events grabbed the attention of the Ohio governor, Jim Rhodes, who sent in the National Guard to keep order and prevent further conflict. On the evening of May 2nd, the Guard arrived on campus to find the ROTC building ablaze. They forced protesters into dormitories for the evening. May 3rd was uneventful for most of the day, but it proved to be the calm before the storm. In the evening, protesters staged a sit-in at a street intersection. When asked to disperse, they refused, and the Guard used tear gas to break up the crowd. There was a demonstration scheduled to take place on May 4th, but flyers were distributed, canceling the event. Nearly 2,000 protesters showed up anyway. The National Guard drove the protesters up the hill in the Commons area and down into the fenced-in practice field. The Guard then retreated back up the hill with protesters following behind. No one knows what initiated the action, but the National Guard suddenly wheeled and fired into the crowd. Despite the tragedy, the government held the ROTC Awards on May 5th, the day following the shootings. I was quite disappointed at the lack of respect for the students who were killed. I guess the government was just trying to show that protesting the war would not be tolerated, but it seemed quite cold-hearted. And as a result of the awards ceremony, as well as the unfair shootings, there was a chain reaction of protests at colleges all across the country. On one hand, the protests were considered a success at shortening the duration of the war. But on the other hand, the protests were considered a failure, as they divided the country and created a war within a war. Unfortunately, 4 students had to die as a result. Now, many unanswered questions remain to this day. Should the National Guard have been called to Kent State University in the first place? Quite possibly, the use of the Guard incited protesters to become more violent. Could local law enforcement agencies have handled the situation? They were successful at driving the protesters out of downtown Kent and back to Kent State campus on the night of May 2nd. Did Kent State University officials act appropriately when banning demonstrations and enforcing early curfew? Many people say the actions of the officials violated First Amendment rights. We will now observe a moment of silence for the 4 slain students and ignite this candle to honor all 4 of their memories. me introduce myself. I am Ron Slater and was a proud member of the National Guard back in 1970. On May 2nd, our top commander received a call from the Honorable Jim Rhodes, the governor of Ohio. He was requesting our presence at the Kent State campus. Apparently, students were protesting the United States entering the war in Cambodia. Can you believe that? Why would anyone question the judgment of our nation's leader, President Richard Nixon? President Nixon stated he wanted to attack the headquarters of the Viet Cong. It was thought they were using Cambodia as a haven for military activity during the Vietnam War. Our assignment was to keep order and prevent further conflict at Kent State. A lot of us thought that young people in this day and age didn't have respect for our government, or any type of authority for that matter. Most of the soldiers in my unit were already stationed in northeastern Ohio, so it didn't take us long to mobilize. News trickled in of a demonstration held a day earlier by the Kent State students, in which draft cards were burned and a copy of the Constitution was buried. On May 2nd, we arrived on campus to find the ROTC building in flames. We had also heard of a violent confrontation between the local police and drunken protesters the night before. When local establishments closed their doors to contain the crowd, the protesters grew angry and began to build bonfires in the streets and overturn cars. They were eventually forced back on campus by local police using tear gas. As we assembled at our assigned locations, we noticed a large group of students gathering in the area near the smoldering remains of the ROTC building. Many of them chanting loudly, calling us pigs, and yelling for us to go home. We were successful at dispersing this group with canisters of tear gas. Most of the day on May 3rd proved to be uneventful. We were very hopeful the situation was improving. But in the evening, we were called to the street intersection of East Main and Lincoln Streets to disperse a crowd staging a sit-in. The next day, I was relieved to hear the demonstration scheduled for that day had been canceled. But at noon, the tide changed when a group of over 2,000 students assembled near the Victory Bell to once again protest our involvement in the war. Soldiers were ordered to drive the protesters up the hill, past Taylor Hall, and down into the fenced-in practice field. The guard then retreated back up the hill with protesters falling behind. In one quick motion, a group of soldiers turned and fired into the protesters. They say the 60 or so rounds of fire lasted only 13 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. And in the end, 4 students were mortally wounded and 9 others were injured. So, what was the reason for the National Guard opening fire, you might ask? During an ensuing trial, the 8 guardsmen that shot into the crowd said they feared for their lives and fired in self-defense. The case was dismissed. Now, there are many unanswered questions. Should the National Guard have been called to Kent State University in the first place? The Guard was, in fact, called by local law enforcement officials because they believed that radical revolutionaries were in Kent to destroy the city and the university. Could local law enforcement agencies have handled the situation? The mayor of Kent was afraid the local forces would be inadequate to meet the potential disturbances. Did Kent State University officials act appropriately when banning demonstrations and enforcing early curfew? First Amendment rights can be overruled when public safety is at stake. These questions can still be debated today based on different perspectives. So, you need to decide for yourself based on the evidence presented. Thank you.
Due to time constraints, what do you wish you could have put in, but because you only had 10 minutes, you had to decide to keep out?
Well, in the beginning, when I was kind of creating a rough draft of what I was going to do in my presentation, I was thinking about doing 3 perspectives, because as you saw in my performance, as the photographer who photographed the famous Pulitzer Prize-winning photo, he wasn't one of the protesters. So he was more mature, you could say. He wasn't actually partaking, and he didn't have as strong an opinion as maybe another perspective might have had. So he was still on the student side, but he was a little more of a base, like a neutral perspective. So as a guardsman, I was, a stronger perspective, and if I had more time, I would have liked to add that stronger perspective, except an opposite side.
And what would have been, who or what would have been that opposite perspective?
Well, actually, one of the students that died, his name was Jeffrey Miller. He was he was a rioter. He liked to get into it. He liked to, show them signs of, give them the finger or something like that. And you could see in all the photographs, he was always right in the front. He was always the one chanting at them, calling them names. And so maybe I could have brought him into it, maybe given him a little time into it if I had that time. Because he would have definitely given that extra push on the strong side. He would have had an opposite argument from, per se, this character here.
And also, are you an actress, or because your mannerisms, your acting, I'm just wondering if that's something you're very interested in, because you presented the history in this category, so where's that interest come from?
Well, I just love acting. I have sort of a thing for it, and I actually was in a summer program, and there was several plays I was in and stuff. It's just when you bring history to life like this, you don't fall asleep. But if you read it, you can fall asleep. Just standing here and actually working it out, you can picture it in your head. It's much better to have like vivid actions and stuff that keeps your mind flowing freely and everything, and keep it going.
Okay, so last thing. She asked, is there anything you would like to have had? What was the favorite thing that you did include?
Well, I did like the fact that I had, I don't know if you realize this, but I had a flashback in the beginning. And what that kind of did for me was set me up. So you guys sort of had a little bit of background on it before I actually started getting into the, oh, we're against everybody. Because if you don't know what truly happened and what there is to debate about, there's no reason in debating about it.
Good point.
So you portrayed two sides. You portrayed the protester side and you portrayed the National Guard side. What sources did you use to best represent each side for you, the sources you chose?
Well, there was a source in there that said there was like an audio tour that I actually went to Kent State for, and you could sort of tell by some of the words they used that they were kind of on the side for the federal justice or the guardsmen, because the government thought they were rebels, and also there were letters in there that were written from the students and from some other people, alumni, to a teacher at Kent State University after the building had been completely cleared, that said some of them showed anger, some of them showed confusion, and others said the students deserved it. They should never have gotten out of hand like that. But some other ones are, crazy. They're saying the government should have handled this. Some saying the students had handled this. So really the letters, and I would say the poems, help me get the emotions from each of the sides to really put it together into a script.